So today I'd like to talk a little bit about the last couple ideas in our kinetics unit, which is really just adding a little bit more depth and background to some ideas that we actually introduced on the very first day of the unit. On that first day, we talked about the 4 factors that affect the rate of a chemical reaction. Concentration, we've spent a whole bunch of time talking about at this point. We also briefly discussed the state of our reactants and the surface area of solids. So the 2 I want to talk about in a little bit more depth today are the effects of temperature and catalysts on our reaction rate. So first up is temperature. We know that increasing the temperature of a system increases the average kinetic energy of the particles. So when our particles collide, they do so with greater energy on average. This means that a greater percentage of our collisions occur with at least the activation energy. They occur with at least that minimum amount of energy required in order for the collision to successfully result in reaction. So if we think about this in terms of a Maxwell-Boltzmann distribution, as shown on the right, we see here that this is depicting the distribution of molecular speeds at a particular temperature. So our x-axis is increasing molecular speed, and the curve is showing us how many particles have each speed. At some particular temperature, this one is labeled as 300 Kelvin. So we know that molecular speed is related to energy, is related to kinetic energy of our particles. So the faster the particle is moving, the more kinetic energy it has. That means that somewhere along this x-axis, along this speed axis, is the minimum energy required for reaction. So if we pick a spot and say, let's let this be our activation energy, that this right here is how fast a particle must be moving in order to have enough energy to react. That means that every particle moving that fast and faster could potentially undergo reaction. Anything with less energy than that, if it collides with another molecule, it doesn't matter. If it has the proper orientation or not, that collision cannot be successful if it does not have enough energy. So we can see the shaded pink area here represents the molecules that have enough energy in order to react, anything above the activation energy. Now, if we increase the temperature, we're going to be changing the shape of our distribution. That as temperature increases, our molecular speed increases, which means our entire peak here in our distribution is going to shift over to the right and actually get shorter as well. It kind of gets more spread out as you increase the temperature. So if we crank the heat up to 1000 Kelvin, we would get a distribution that looks something more like this. Note that we haven't changed the activation energy. The energy requirement is exactly the same when we change the temperature. We're just giving more of our molecules enough energy. So we're increasing the energy of the molecules themselves, not how much energy is required. But the shaded blue region here shows how many molecules at 1000 Kelvin would have enough energy to react. And you can see that it's a much larger portion of the graph. It's a much larger portion of our molecules, meaning that a greater percentage of collisions will occur with at least the activation energy. So by increasing the energy of the molecules, we put more of them above that barrier. We put more of them above that minimum so that we get a faster reaction because we have more successful collisions. So in terms of catalysts, there are essentially 2 different ways that a catalyst can work. And a catalyst can do both, so can function in one or both of these ways. The first is that it can alter the mechanism of the chemical reaction so that the rate-limiting step has a lower activation energy. And this can look a lot of different ways. It can either be that your mechanism is mostly not changed very much, but the rate-limiting step gets easier. The rate-limiting step gets its activation energy lowered. Or it can completely restructure your mechanism. So you may have, in the absence of a catalyst, a very simple 1 or 2 step mechanism, and then you add a catalyst and all of a sudden your mechanism has a whole bunch more steps. But usually what that does is take a small number of relatively complicated, challenging steps and breaks them down into a longer series of simpler steps. So if each step is easier, each step has a lower activation energy. The lower the activation energy, the faster the reaction. Catalysts can also affect the orientation in which collisions are able to occur. We know that the two things that need to happen in order for collision to be successful is that collision has to have enough energy and it has to occur in the proper orientation. So this type of catalyst is kind of taking care of that orientation factor. It's making sure that most or all of your collisions happen in the proper orientation, which leads to a higher success rate and therefore a faster reaction. So let's look at an example of each. First up is changing the mechanism. So without a catalyst, this reaction, the decomposition of hydrogen peroxide, occurs pretty slowly via a one-step mechanism. If you've ever seen a bottle of hydrogen peroxide or bought one at the store, it's commonly used for disinfecting and stuff around the house. It usually comes in a dark brown, completely opaque bottle. And the reason for that is that one catalyst for this reaction is actually light. The right wavelengths of light will make this reaction go faster. Light's not a terribly effective catalyst, but it is a catalyst for this nonetheless. So it always comes in a dark bottle. But even in a complete absence of light, this reaction still happens, just slowly, where your hydrogen peroxide, H2O2, is converted into water and oxygen gas. So this is also why hydrogen peroxide bottles have an expiration date on them. Not because it goes bad in the sense that it will be bad for you, but that it becomes ineffective because over time your hydrogen peroxide turns into water and there's nothing you can do about it. But it is a slow reaction, so it usually has a shelf life of a year or two, I think, before it becomes largely ineffective in that it has mostly turned to water. So there are lots of different catalysts for this reaction, but one of the more commonly used ones is the iodide or I- ion, which changes the mechanism to a two-step mechanism with a lower activation energy. So the steps are shown here, where the hydrogen peroxide reacts with the catalyst, the I-, to form water and an intermediate. And then that intermediate goes on to react with another molecule of hydrogen peroxide to form water, oxygen gas, and reproduce the catalyst. So you'll see the catalyst being reproduced at the end, so it is truly catalytic. And if we look at the energy diagram on the right, this compares the uncatalyzed and catalyzed reactions. So the uncatalyzed we can see is a single peak that is relatively high. Remember, the height of that peak is the activation energy. The catalyzed version shows two little peaks that are shorter than the uncatalyzed one. So in these types of diagrams, each peak represents a step in the mechanism. So we can tell that the catalyzed reaction is a two-step mechanism because there are two peaks in its energy diagram. And we can see that this reaction would be faster because both of those peaks have a lower height or lower activation energy than the uncatalyzed process. So this reaction in the presence of I- as a catalyst, you may have heard referred to as the elephant toothpaste reaction or elephant toothpaste demonstration that you may have seen somewhere on the internet. So this reaction is done in the presence of soap to make this foam. So the foam is not a natural part of the reaction. It's because there's dish soap in the graduated cylinder before they add the other reactants. So that when that oxygen gas is produced, instead of just bubbling away, it's much more dramatic and much more entertaining for that oxygen to get trapped inside the soap bubbles and make this big poofy foam. But the presence of the I- catalyst is why it happens so quickly and so vigorously. If you just mixed everything together without the catalyst, it would look like nothing is happening. The reaction is very, very slow without any kind of catalyst. Even light does catalyze it, but not well. It's still a reaction that's generally too slow to observe. You might see some bubbles form after like an hour, but it takes a while. But the I- is a very effective catalyst and makes this reaction all happen in a couple seconds instead of hours or months. So if we think about this in terms of particle energies and a Maxwell-Boltzmann distribution, when we change the mechanism, we're lowering the barrier for reaction. We are not changing the energy of our molecules. We are changing the amount of energy required. So in the distribution shown to the right, I have the uncatalyzed activation energy labeled, and the shaded purple region shows without a catalyst. This is the fraction of molecules that is able to react, and it's pretty small. So in this case, we're actually changing where that barrier is. If we change the mechanism, the activation energy is different, which means that it's a different point along our x-axis. A lower speed, a lower energy is required in order for the reaction to occur. So we haven't changed a darn thing about the energy of our molecules, but we have changed what amount of energy is required to react. So just by lowering that barrier, we now give a much larger fraction of our molecules the ability to undergo reaction because our activation energy is lower. So the other way that catalysts can work is through affecting the collision orientation. Some catalysts bind with your reactant molecules in such a way that they hold them in the proper orientation for reaction, which increases the percentage of successful collisions. So this is really common among enzymes in biological systems. You know that the enzyme has an active site that has a very particular shape, which allows it to not only bind to only one specific molecule, but to bind to one specific molecule in one specific orientation. And the reason for this is that it wants to bind to that molecule in that way so that it can facilitate the correct orientation of collision for the reaction. So by only allowing molecules to collide in the proper orientation, it drastically increases the success rate of those collisions, thereby making the reaction a whole lot faster. So quick overview of what we talked about today. Increasing the temperature increases the energy of the molecules, meaning more particles have the minimum energy required, so a higher temperature leads to a faster reaction. Adding a catalyst can lower the activation energy, so lowering the energy required means that more particles will have enough, so reactions with lower activation energy proceed at a faster rate. Adding a catalyst can also improve what I like to refer to as the orientation accuracy of collisions, which means that more collisions will occur in the correct orientation, which also leads to a faster reaction.